Welcome. I'm Elizabeth Donahue. I'm the Associate Dean here for Public and External Affairs, and welcome to today's talk, Can the Middle Class Be Saved? Our speaker is one of our MPA alums, which we always appreciate when alumni come back, and as all of you know, we have such an illustrative alumni. It's wonderful when they can come back and talk. He graduated with an MPA in 1994. So Don Peck is the features editor at The Atlantic, where he covers economics and culture, among other subjects, and commissions many of the magazine's feature stories. And today's talk is really going to be based on a new book that he has out, which is called Pinched: How the Great Recession Has Narrowed Our Features and What We Can Do About It. And the book, which he'll probably talk about, is based on a cover story from the March 2010 issue of The Atlantic. And in it, he analyzes more than 100 years of economic recessions, depressions, and recoveries, and details how the lingering effects of our current recession will be felt by those hardest hit. And as probably many of you saw in today's New York Times, there are a number of families out there who the uptake on the school lunch program has gone up quite a bit. So this issue of the lingering effects, not just what's happening to families once the recession is quote unquote over, but what's going to keep going and affect these families is of great importance and probably not getting a lot of coverage in our current media. So we're very happy that he's here to talk about this issue. I think you'll talk for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up to questions, and thanks for coming.
Thanks, Elizabeth. It's a very nice introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's great fun to be back here. It's been a while, but Dodds looks the same, at least. I don't. So let me talk a little bit about just kind of who I am and kind of why I'm in front of you right now before I really get into the talk. So as Elizabeth said, I'm a features editor at The Atlantic. And I don't know, what everyone thinks of The Atlantic. I think we can all agree that one characteristic of The Atlantic is that its stories are very, very long. And one of the kind of pleasures and challenges of my job, because most of my job is trying to find cover stories for us and edit those stories and sometimes write them, is to think 6-9 months ahead of time, because these stories do take several months to report and write typically, and try to identify stories that we can start now that are still going to feel topical and timely, 10 months from now. So I remember in March 2009, the economy had stopped its free fall following the crash of 2008. The TARP had been passed, the stimulus had been passed, the stock market had rebounded. And I remember breathing a sigh of relief, and I think many people around me were doing the same. But because of my day job, I was also interviewing a lot of labor economists and economic historians and students of past financial crashes, asking them, what the future might hold based on their experience. And what they told me, almost uniformly, almost everyone was sounding the same note here, was that we were breathing a premature sigh of relief, that recovery was likely to take many years, and that we were in for some very rough weather. And when I started reading histories then of other long downturns, not short recessions, but long downturns, the 1890s, the 1930s, the 1970s, I became convinced that society was about to change in profound and wide-ranging ways, in ways that we hadn't really begun to contemplate, because often social changes in weak economic times that are imperceptible in the first 2 or 3 years become suddenly overwhelming by year 5 or 7 or 8. So this seemed to me a very rich and important subject. I've spent the past 2 years largely studying it. I've looked at other historical periods. I've spent a lot of time around the country in places like Reading and Tampa and Aspen and Phoenix, because this recession has affected different places and different people in very, very different ways. It's affected different classes in very, very different ways, and I think that's really important to understanding this period and recovery. Generally, I've spent the last 2 years trying to understand how this period is changing the places we live, the work we do, our family lives, and especially for those who've lost a job, even in some cases who we are. The title of this talk is, Can the Middle Class Be Saved? I will spend a lot of time on that subject, but what I want to do more broadly is talk about the ways that prolonged weak periods leave enduring marks on society. That's one of the kind of principal findings from my study of historical periods that look a bit like this one, is that we think of recessions as temporary. We think of changes as ephemeral. We will, of course, recover from this period. But what we saw in the 1890s and the 1930s and the 1970s is that once we recovered, society looked very different. In some ways stronger, in some ways weaker, in some ways simply changed. That's mostly what I want to talk about today. So three main messages of my talk. One is that periods like this do have enduring consequences, some of which can be seen for decades. Two, that this particular recession has accelerated some deep economic forces that were already moving through society, most particularly the hollowing of the middle class. And as a result, it's allowed us to see with unusual clarity where American society and where American class seems to be headed today. And then three, we can recover from this period faster. It's not fated that this needs to take 5 more years to recover. But we need to think about recovery more broadly than we have been today. When you look at the range of changes that are moving through society as a result of high unemployment and economic weakness, the kinds of solutions, even that we've proposed, I think, are really insufficient to the problems that we're facing and beginning with increasing clarity to see. So part one, the enduring consequences of this period. Society changes in a really wide and sometimes surprising variety of ways during economic downturns. People sleep more, they date less, they spend more time at home, they drive less and more slowly, and as a result, traffic fatalities and with them overall mortality tend to decline, as they have in this period since 2007. Skirts famously lengthen and pop songs become more complex, more romantic, yet less sexual. And in general, a sort of personal conservatism seems to pervade almost all aspects of life. Now, many of these changes are ephemeral, and they typically go away as soon as the economy starts booming again. But deep, long slumps leave enduring marks to family life, to communities marked by high unemployment, to the places we live generally, and if they persist long enough, to our culture. In the 1970s, inner cities collapsed largely as a result of prolonged economic weakness following the sudden loss of manufacturing from those areas. High, prolonged unemployment among less skilled black men fundamentally changed family life, marriage, led to single parenthood, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and an increase in the incidence of crime. And all of those changes kind of tipped inner cities into a long downward spiral that proved very, very difficult to reverse. It hasn't been reversed for all inner cities, and it took a couple of decades to begin to reverse in many others. Inner cities are again struggling today as a result of economic weakness, but I think we're seeing that same phenomenon today occurring as well in exurbs in the US, particularly around cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Tampa, where I spent a lot of time. These are places which were massively overbuilt. They were populated by people who moved there largely for cheap and rising housing, people with moderate education typically, not extremely high skills. The local economies were predicated largely on real estate. And now that the boom has turned to bust, people there are stuck and struggling. People who can leave are leaving. And the people who remain are seeing half-vacant neighborhoods, rising crime, deteriorating schools, and in some cases kind of really a severe challenge to the middle-class dream and middle-class lifestyle that they had. So this period will leave specific geographic scars that will endure, I think, for many years. It will, of course, leave scars on the unemployed themselves. The average duration of unemployment in the US today is over 9 months. It's about as high, since the recession, it's been higher than it's ever been since the Bureau of Labor Statistics started recording that figure in 1948. And when people are without a job for a year or two or more, it becomes very, very difficult for them to simply resume their careers or even get back into the job market, even once the economy comes back, even once jobs come back generally. We're seeing a lot of job ads today that say some variant of people who are unemployed need not apply. These are popping up again and again on Monster and on other boards. They're usually taken down once the press takes note of them, but others keep popping up. And I think that's in part just a sign of how much power employers have today in such a weak job environment, but it might portend something more enduring as well. When people are without a job for a year or two or more, employers eventually simply begin to ignore them. They begin to suspect personal or professional dysfunction, whether or not it's present, and sometimes it is because we know from abundant research that unemployment over time is a severe psychological trauma, roughly equivalent to the death of a spouse, happiness experts have found, and it leads to changed habits, loss of confidence, loss of social networks, and it becomes very, very difficult for those reasons and because of employer judgments for people who are unemployed for a year or two or more to find work again. There's actually an economic term for this, it's hysteresis. Employers simply begin to, when they have job openings, poach from other employers or look to the newly unemployed. The long-term unemployed fall out of the market and the economy somewhat shrunken, just moves on without them. Europe experienced this problem throughout the 80s and 90s. It has not been a problem that the US has faced to date on a widespread basis, but if this period goes on much longer, the US is going to face that problem, and that is one more reason, I think, why the urgency of recovery is especially high today. The last group I want to talk about and talk about a little bit more as to kind of enduring consequences and enduring changes is the millennial generation, and particularly people in their late teens, early 20s, mid 20s. When I started my research for my book, I kind of presumed that this period would leave its lightest scars on young people, on young adults. They don't have many responsibilities. They're in and out of the job market anyway. Few have mortgages or children. But in fact, history and abundant economic research shows that young people in particular are likely to bear the heaviest scars in many ways from this recession. The first few years in the job market are extraordinarily important to setting one's entire career path. And people who struggle early because of no job or a bad job simply don't catch up later. The work of Lisa Kahn, an economist at Yale, is just one example of evidence of this. Kahn looked at people who graduated from college during the short but very deep recession of the early 1980s, and what she found was that people who graduated into that recession not only started out behind, they had to take jobs that on average paid 25% less than the cohorts around them, but that even 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, they still hadn't caught up to where they otherwise would have been. They were still about 10% in earning power behind where they should have been. And when she looked deeper, what she found was that they had some interesting characteristics. They were disproportionately outside of the professions, stuck in low status jobs, and they clung more tightly to their jobs as well. Job tenure was unusually high. And Kahn speculates that one reason for that was probably a personal conservatism that developed among them. But another reason was that they couldn't switch jobs. They had acquired a stigma of underachievement or low potential, which made it harder, frankly, to switch because employers didn't want to hire them, so they stuck with what jobs they had. I worry that same thing is happening to millennials today, and I worry that the character of millennials is changing as well. It's been really painful to watch this recession meet this particular generation. People in their 20s and even in their 30s, I think, grew up hearing that they were special, that they were destined for great things. Early in the recession, the term fun employment kind of came into the lexicon for a time as particularly college graduates thought they could just sit the recession out, perhaps move home and just resume a terrific career once hard times passed. Those attitudes are by now gone, and we're seeing evidence in millennials of some of the same conservatism that Kahn noted in a prior generation. Pew, for instance, did a survey recently that asked millennials if they had their preference, whether they would like to stick with one employer or change jobs throughout their career. About 2/3 said they wanted to stick with one employer. Asked what they valued most in a career. Overwhelmingly, a majority said job security. The generational changes from this period aren't all negative, of course. Or aren't likely to be all negative. I think what we saw in the Depression certainly was the growth of an attitude of thrift, which lasted for a generation or more afterwards, and was really only undone by the long inflation of the 1970s. Certainly, in my conversations with millennials today, I'm hearing a lot that. This period has changed their relationship with money, their ideals about family, and about the importance of friendship versus career. The Depression also shows us that while 20-somethings who struggled earlier in their careers really were marked for the rest of their lives in many ways, in their attitudes, in their agency, in their feelings of self-efficacy, and in their earning power. Adolescents were changed very differently, and here I'm drawing on the work of the North Carolina sociologist Glenn Elder. What he found was so many of the scars of unemployment, of economic hardship, are psychological, and adolescents didn't feel any of that. They couldn't be blamed for their family's economic struggles. At the same time, they were counted on for more than the generations around them. They were probably pampered less. And they grew into the greatest generation. They were unusually family-oriented. They were able to defer gratification, unusually civic-minded. And so I wonder how this period will affect today's adolescents. I certainly think that adolescents throughout the country, particularly middle-class kids, are being indulged a bit less than normal, and I think that could have some long-term benefits. So anyway, that's just quickly kind of part one, the enduring consequences of this period. It's part two, and the main thing I want to talk about today, the way kind of this period has accelerated deep changes to our society, that were already running through society, and particularly the hollowing of the middle class. So in many ways, this has been a middle-class recession, in part because of the vast importance of housing to the recession. If you look at the wealth lost by class status from 2007 to 2009, wealthy Americans lost about 12% of their wealth. Middle-class Americans lost about 25% of their wealth on average. That's highly unusual in a recession, but it is the fundamental characteristic of this recession because housing has collapsed so completely and has not recovered while the equity market has recovered. This has been particularly harmful to middle-class families, and particularly the non-professional middle class, which is what I call people who have a high school degree but not a four-year college degree. That's about 60% of American adults. Because wages, median wages, the wages of high school graduates had not been increasing even before the crash, for about a decade. People had been using home equity and rising home values to sustain increasing lifestyles, a sense of progress. That all collapsed with this recession. And what we've seen then in the past 3 years is not just 3 years of disappointment, but really the accumulated disappointment of a decade. When we look at the recovery so far, what we see is that well-educated Americans, wealthy Americans, Wealthy areas are largely recovering. Wage growth has been very high in Manhattan and Silicon Valley over the past couple of years. Spending has increased among wealthy Americans. Gallup did a survey recently that showed that between May 2009 and May of this year, all of the consumer recovery, such as it's been, has been the result of the top 20% of Americans. Daily spending among the bottom 80% had not increased at all over that 2-year period. Geographically, again, you look at kind of quintessentially middle-class cities like Tampa and Las Vegas and Phoenix struggling badly, places like New York, D.C., Boston coming back. My hometown of D.C., by the way, according to a recent Gallup survey, is the most optimistic city in the country right now as to the state and future of the economy. And it's really no wonder. It's also one of the best educated regions in the country. And I can tell you, in the professional communities of Washington, D.C., there is no evidence of the recession. Everyone seems to be doing fine, which I think may help explain the political reaction to the crash, especially once the stock market started going up again. So those are all just kind of stray data and kind of trend watching. I think there's a more fundamental thing that's happening to the middle class in this recession, though, and that's really what I'd really like to focus on. David Autor, an economist at MIT, has done a careful analysis of job losses in this recession by class and by skill level. And he separated Americans out into 3 basic categories: low-skill jobs, things like food preparation, security, the things that dropouts can generally do, as well as high school graduates. High-skill jobs, largely in the professions and in technical occupations, and then middle-skill jobs, jobs in manufacturing, non-managerial office work, and so on. And what he found is that, of course, jobs should have been growing throughout this period and haven't been, but there was no net job reduction since 2007 among high-skill jobs in the U.S. There was almost no net job reduction among low-skill jobs in America since 2007. Almost all of the job loss on net since the recession has been to middle-skill jobs, the jobs that have traditionally provided a middle-class lifestyle to people, again, with a high school diploma, but not a 4-year college degree. And those people, the true middle class for America, have by the million been dropping out of the middle class, competing increasingly for jobs at the bottom of the ladder that have typically been filled by high school dropouts. Data on job growth since the recession ended is not terribly good as to occupation and structure yet, but as best we can tell, the job growth that we've had since the recession ended has been largely at the bottom of the economy, not a reintroduction of those middle-skill jobs. And what's happened really is that companies have simply accelerated something that they've been doing for years: offshoring and restructuring during this recession. They've taken they've had to because of the recession, and they've taken the opportunity to make offshoring decisions, to make restructuring decisions that otherwise would have taken them many, many years, that they would have done perhaps as attrition and retirement allowed. And that's why we've seen such particular pain for middle-skill Americans in this recession. The direction of globalization, the direction of technological change has been particularly harmful to middle-skill Americans, middle-class Americans, whose jobs increasingly can be done by computers in the office, by robots in factories, or by increasingly educated lower-wage workers in India, in China, and in other countries. The middle class, the non-professional middle class, has been struggling for many years, in many ways since the 1970s, but we've seen a huge uptick in those struggles since the recession. I don't believe that many of those middle-skill jobs are likely to come back. Jobs will come back, but they won't be the same jobs. Many people who've lost their job, many formerly middle-class people who've lost their job in this recession will not find their way back into the middle class without specific and aggressive help. I want to talk a little bit about the particular struggles of men and non-professional middle-class men in this recession too, because I think this is particularly important to understanding the future of class in America. Men, of course, were particularly hard hit in the recession. It was called the Mancession. 3/4 of all pink slips delivered were delivered to men. Men always do worse in recessions because they're concentrated overwhelmingly in more cyclical jobs like manufacturing, like construction, which of course were hard hit in this recession. But really, again, this can be viewed as well, in this case, as an acceleration of longer-term trends. I don't think anyone thinks that the construction is going to regain its prior heights or that manufacturing is going to come all the way back. In fact, if you look at manufacturing employment, it's been declining as a percentage of the economy, but it's really kind of remarkable and not what most people think. The level of manufacturing employment remained about the same at 16 to 18 million from about 1970 through 2000. Since 2000, it's fallen by a third. About 6 million jobs have been lost since that time. So that's been accelerated in this recession. Manufacturing will bounce back. It's already bounced back a little bit, but there's no reason to think that those jobs are in the main going to be coming back. People are being replaced by machines on the factory floor. So men in particular have struggled in the recession, and again, men have struggled really for a long time as we've moved beyond an industrial economy to a post-industrial economy. As those kind of outdoor and blue-collar opportunities have disappeared, men by and large have not responded by getting college degrees in larger number. About the same percentage of the percentage of men who graduate from college today is about the same as it was in 1980. So men have not loaded into school as women have. Men have not loaded into growing service sector occupations, sectors like healthcare and education, which remain as dominated as by women now as they did at the beginning of the decade. Instead, what men have done is, by and large, they've simply been exiting the workforce, slowly until 2007 and much more quickly thereafter. In 1967, among men with a high school diploma only in their prime working years, 97% were working. Today, 76% are. Why is a puzzle? And maybe we can talk about that a little bit in Q&A if people want to. But again, for whatever reason, a meaningful minority of men have struggled as manufacturing jobs and now construction jobs have been going away and have not been able to find good alternatives. Why am I harping so much on men? They still make more on average than women. Discrimination still exists, of course, towards women. All of these things are true. But when men struggle economically, when they are jobless or struggling, it is particularly important to society because it tends to have large implications on family and communities. Women tend not to marry men who are unemployed or economically struggling, but they do have children with them. And those children typically struggle if their parents, as is typically the case, don't stay together. So when you have men struggling, when you have changes in family structure, you can also start to see intergenerational problems arising because of the upbringing of children in those households. Single parenthood reached a record level in 2009, which is the last year of available data. It had been trending up anyway. The recession is not solely to blame for this. Men's economic struggles are not solely responsible for this. But as men have struggled more and more over the past 3 decades, and particularly in the last decade, and most especially in the last 3 years, Families are changing around the U.S. They are changing very specifically in non-professional middle-class communities and families, and I fear that that could have very long-ranging consequences. When you look at the cultural habits and family patterns of people with a high school diploma but not a four-year college degree, in 1970, those family patterns and cultural habits very much resembled those of college graduates as to marriage rates, single parenthood rates, and so on. Today, the family structure and cultural habits of people with a high school diploma closely resemble those of high school dropouts. The rate of, if you look at birth rates, for instance, among high school dropouts in 2008, 54% of all births to high school dropouts were to single mothers. Among people with a high school diploma, that number was 44%. Among college graduates, that number was 6%. So we're seeing a very strong cultural cleavage between college graduates and kind of everyone else that really did not exist 20 or 30 years ago. And it's having, I worry that unaddressed, that will have very, very large implications for opportunity and mobility in the future, and for the ability of children growing up in non-college households to achieve middle class and upper class lifestyles. Let me talk. I mean, I've been kind of barraging everyone with just a lot of statistics and blather. Let me talk briefly about one guy that I spoke with, because I think it speaks to kind of the struggles of men and family, and I think it's kind of a telling and typical story. So outside of Reading, Pennsylvania, I interviewed a guy who I call Frank Miceli in my book. He was 46 at the time. He'd worked outside for most of his life. He started out in a factory, but then went to construction, became a construction foreman. And he lost his job in 2008 and couldn't find anything else afterwards. He's a great guy. He's a really good guy. He and his wife, when they were together, they divorced after he lost his job, had adopted 8 children, and supported them for years. Frank knew that retraining efforts were available to him through government programs, but he told me he hadn't tried any of them because he felt like he was too old, and he said he wasn't much of a classroom guy. He'd never done well in high school, and the thought of going back to school, frankly, terrified him. He went to he knew that there were kind of interviewing services and HR assistants available to him through his local church group, and he did try going to those for a while. His church group brought in a human resources specialist who was conducting mock interviews to help people build interviewing skills. And she interviewed Frank, who has a very gruff manner and unflattering things to say about one former boss. And she told him that the way he was presenting himself, he was just never going to get a job outside of construction. And his response to her, he told me, was, well, you can kiss my ass. You know, I do good work, and that's what should matter. He'd spent his life in an environment where the norms of communication are very different, social expectations are very different, and he's really struggled with a transition. What he's done, in fact, to support his children over the last few years is he's basically been looking through his neighbor's trash. He's learned the trash pickup schedule for his neighborhood and town and the towns around it, and he goes out and looks for scrap to salvage, old washing machines, appliances, and so on. I think he is kind of typical of many of the middle-aged men that are struggling in this recession, who have found middle-class lives and middle-class livelihoods stripped from them, and who are really struggling to find new ones. And I think his family struggles in the wake of this recession is typical too. So that's part two. How this period is accelerating, in my opinion, the hollowing of the middle class. and the social problems that are increasingly afflicting the true middle class, the non-professional middle class, that we can see very clearly today and that I think are likely to become more severe in the future. I don't want to talk for much longer, so I'll go quickly here. So part three is kind of what can we do to get out of this period, and what can we do to try to strengthen and buttress the middle class in particular. So I did go to policy school here, but I'm not a policy analyst by trade. I've spent most of my time in writing my book and the magazine articles around it, trying to chronicle what was happening. Much of what I've done is descriptive. But I've spent some time as well thinking about solutions, talking to experts, reading fairly widely. I think that when we think of this period, it is absolutely right to say that the most severe problem facing America is fundamentally a lack of demand in the wake of a large financial crisis in which people are still rebuilding their savings. And it is absolutely right and appropriate and necessary for the government to step in this sort of time and stimulate the economy, provide the spending and the jobs that consumers cannot for a period of years. And it is a real mistake, in my opinion, and God knows, I'm not alone, but it's a real mistake to be moving towards austerity now and away from expansion that will only delay recovery. And that will doom many more young people to worse life paths. It will doom many more people who are without jobs today to much more severe troubles in the future as their unemployment extends. It will have long-term consequences that I believe we systematically underestimate today. The debt is a real problem in the U.S. We need to take steps today to try to, binding steps to address it as soon as the economy is objectively healthy again, but it isn't, and we're making a real mistake by not pursuing a more expansionist policy. All that said, the focus on stimulus and job creation today, while warranted, I think are in part myopic as well, or certainly they are insufficient to the breadth of the problems we're facing today, and particularly the problems that the middle class is facing. Even as jobs come back, again, they are not the same jobs. They are not the middle class jobs that people had before. We need to begin thinking, when we really think about true recovery and long-term recovery, I think we need to begin to think about ways to rebuild the middle class, provide middle-class lifestyles for people who are losing them today or who can't step into them today. And that has, little to do with stimulus. I think what it has to do with, in part, is a change in our educational system. I think the U.S. has been taking good steps towards improving K-12 education, over the past few years. We need to continue and redouble those efforts. But I also think that we as to education, we've focused far too much, I think, on the centrality of a four-year college degree. We've beat the drum so loudly and for so long on a four-year college degree that it shouldn't surprise us, I don't think, when people who don't get a four-year college degree struggle at age 18, and when men in particular struggle. I think vocational programs actually have a lot to recommend them, vocational and apprenticeship programs, such as Germany has pursued. There's a growing number of what are called career academies in the U.S., which provide both classroom training and more technical work-related skills along with apprenticeships. They've been very successful, particularly for boys, in attaching them to the workforce, increasing their earnings quickly, and by the way, as they've done that, also massively decreasing the incidence of absentee parenthood among those young men. Those are things I think that we should expand greatly today in an effort to provide alternative paths into the middle class for all Americans, but particularly for boys who are struggling early and whose struggles affect family and parenthood just a few years later. I think we need to, well, there's a whole section in my book on technology and accelerating the rate of breakthrough technology, the creation of new industries, new services, new products, which are extremely important to job growth and to middle-class job growth. I'm not going to go into that here for reasons of time, but I can talk about that in the Q&A. The last thing I would say is, you know, when you look at the structure of job loss, when you look at the power of the forces moving through society, technological changes resulting from globalization, you know, I do think that at least for the next 5-10 years, possibly more, we are going to have to accept that perhaps a larger number of people are going to be in jobs even after we recover that have not historically paid a good wage and have not historically provided a middle-class living. And that, you know, this is a normative judgment, but that leads me to the conclusion that we really should redistribute more widely in the U.S., that we should make the tax code more progressive, and that we should expand programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, you know, which yoke support to work, but which provide essentially a wage subsidy to everyone who is willing to work, and to provide, you know, a decent livelihood to those people. One particular change, which I think is essential, the EITC right now is largely geared towards custodians of children. The benefits available to singles or non-custodians are very, very small. Again, when you look at the nature of what's happening to young men, young women in this economy, I think we would be really well served by expanding the EITC to single young people. This would increase, you know, the economic potential, the economic possibilities for young men. It would encourage marriage. It might arrest some of the family trends that we're seeing. So anyway, I will stop blathering on at this point, and thank you for your very, very kind attention through a very rambling presentation. And I would be happy to take any questions.
So if we can do this as we usually do, come down to the mics. Students, if you're here, please bring your questions down. Community members as well.
Okay, should I go? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I was wondering, you made, well, like two quick questions. One, you sort of mentioned that you thought technological breakthroughs would sort of help to alleviate this. Sorry, you thought that technological breakthroughs would sort of help alleviate this problem, but I sort of viewed that in the last 50 years, technology has been really good at taking sort of low-scale jobs from the middle class and turning them into sort of good jobs for programmers and, you know, people with professional degrees like me. So I was wondering if you would elaborate on that. And my second question was about this article in the New York Magazine called "The Kids Are Actually Sort of All Right," which I think sort of talks on to a number of themes that you've alluded to. And I was sort of wondering about your, I don't know if you've read it, but sort of, you know, your reaction to that.
I actually have not read that piece, so if you want to describe it, I'm happy to try to react. But as to the first part of your question, yeah. So I think it's important to think about two sorts of technology. You know, one is essentially process technology, making existing products more efficiently and more cheaply, you know, by substituting capital for labor, by shifting work around the globe. This is something that companies are very good at, and it's been quite rapid, you know, in the past decade, and it does have very clear implications for skill and class, and those as you've noted, are biased very, very much against middle-skill Americans. The other kind of category that I think of innovation is breakthrough innovations, the kind that create new products, new services, new industries, and ideally, you know, the kinds that such as the internet, you know, that create not just a single new product, but opportunities for many, many new products. What we saw in the 90s, of course, was, you know, when the rate of breakthrough innovations is high, when new products are being created, There's certainly no bias towards middle skill jobs in that kind of a world, but it has a very strong effect on job creation overall. There is some trickle down impact. It alleviates these process trends, and as we saw in the late 90s at least, it really created upward wage growth kind of up and down the economic ladder. What's happened in the last 10 years, and the housing bubble really just kind of masked this, we didn't really notice, was, well, two things. One, the rate of breakthrough innovations by a variety of measures declined substantially, and that's been a real problem for job growth throughout the decade. Job growth was very low throughout the decade. And at the same time, arguably, the importance of raising the rate of breakthrough innovations has become more important because innovations, human capital, knowledge diffuse more quickly today because global connections are more seamless. So that's what I was talking about. Kind of those breakthrough innovations, which have been sparse in the last decade. I think we really need, almost kind of a Manhattan Project to try to reinvigorate the rate of breakthrough technological growth. To some extent, that does involve, more investment in science and R&D. I think it also involves a kind of a different way of viewing regulation and regulatory policy. I think young industries, this is regulatory balance is always extremely difficult in practice, but I think there's a really strong case to be made, as the economist Michael Mandel makes the case, that we should view young industries, in particular industries that could create lots of jobs in the future and really grow. We should view those industries in particular with as much of a laissez-faire attitude as possible, and really strive to reduce regulatory red tape for them and increase their running room. So that's the answer to the first part of your question, at least.
Hi, I'm a Woodrow Wilson student now, but before I came here, I worked at on the opinion side of a newspaper, and this was a newspaper people rave about for being too liberal, but in the editorial board meetings, there was sort of a real deep-seated aversion to calling for any sort of the expansion of the social safety net you're talking about. And I think that's something we see on the politics side too, which is this idea that it's either you're a crazy liberal if you call for this stuff, or you're an idealist, because it could never ever happen. And it seems to me that really affects the constellation of ideas we consider possible. So I'm just curious for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly there's a large ideological divide, in the U.S. today, and things are polarized, and I mean, interestingly, it's particularly, you can fall into a kind of political trap in periods like this very easily. As weakness lingers beyond just a few years, politics become meaner and more contemptuous. People become more jealous of their status relative to others when they're not themselves getting ahead. And they tend to regard politics as more zero-sum and tend to support only those programs, only those changes that will directly benefit them. So it's particularly hard, actually, to expand a social safety net or support people who are falling out of the middle class during a recession or during a period of weak growth. Benjamin Friedman has written very well about this in his book, The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth. But I do think that some of these measures, and like the Earned Income Tax Credit, I think is a really good example. When times aren't so fraught, this is a program that has attracted support across the ideological spectrum, and I think can be expanded, because really what it's saying is it's about the dignity of work. It's not about giving handouts to people who aren't doing anything, and there are downsides to doing that. It's about providing a reasonable social compact to everyone who is willing to toil and work and to make work more dignified. And I think that can attract support across the ideological spectrum, particularly as the economy itself begins to recover again.
Hi, thank you for that good presentation and the research you did on it. My question is a general question involving jobs. We hear a lot of, in the media, creating new jobs, but to me there's two parts. Creating new jobs is one part, but protecting the jobs we have now is hardly mentioned, and that is, it's a lot easier to protect a job that already exists than to create a brand new job. So a lot of corporations, it seems to me, or international corporations have been allowed to go wherever they want to get the lowest labor, lowest raw materials, and our economy has suffered because of that. So do you have any comments or ideas on how to protect the jobs we have now that, to me, seem to be worth protecting by tariffs or any other tax incentives? Because to me, that's a big part of the job situation that is kind of being ignored, in my opinion.
Yeah, you know, I think protectionist measures, while attractive in the short run, you know, tend to be self-defeating, you know, over time, because companies over time, you know, will become less efficient than their foreign rivals, and ultimately lose out as a result. They prompt trade wars, you know, which can hurt exporting companies, you know, hurting jobs in the U.S. So I mean, I don't think that that's necessarily the way to go, but I do think that we can do a better job of protecting jobs in some different ways. You know, I think that while there's a risk of trying to pick winners in the government, I do think that some limited subsidies of young industries that employ many people already, but might see job growth in the future, you know, are certainly worth considering. I think the other thing that's really worth considering right now, in fact, I think we should absolutely do it, is something akin to Germany's short work program. And what this does, this isn't a long-term policy. Well, it is in Germany, but basically, the way unemployment is structured in the U.S., you know, it encourages companies to simply lay off workers and eliminate jobs altogether. Germany has a program, you know, which you may be familiar with, you know, where they encourage companies to reduce the hours of some group or all of their employees rather than laying off people. And the government basically, and the company then pays lower wages, and the government basically makes up the difference. It's kind of a partial unemployment insurance program. And that protects jobs directly. And it doesn't protect all jobs because many companies are going to restructure anyway, but it protects some jobs. And I think that would be really important today. I think it's not too late to do that either in this recession because, you know, the churn in the U.S. economy every month is just enormous. You know, I think about 450,000 jobs are lost each month, and about the same number, you know, hopefully more, you know, are created each month. So if we were to implement a short work program, and if we could just reduce the number of job reductions, you know, each month by doing that, we would create a much more attractive, not only would we protect those jobs, but we would create a much more attractive employment environment for people who are currently unemployed. You know, if fewer jobs are being lost and the same number of jobs are being created, of course you reduce unemployment much faster, you increase consumption much faster, and you get out of this period faster. So I think short work really has a lot to recommend it. It's not too late for it. And it would not only protect jobs today, but probably reduce the unemployment rate much faster.
Yeah, there must be something about every 40 years, I guess, right?
Yeah, seemingly, yeah.
Looking at, taking your knowledge that you've gotten from looking at the past periods, 1890s, 1930s, 1970s, what do you think will be some of the good and positive changes that will come out of all this on the other side, which you seem to have an abiding optimism, you know, will at some point end and we'll get back to, you know, strong growth and boom times, but what will be some of the positive good things you see society and culture looking like when that happens?
Well, I mentioned briefly adolescence and kind of the sort of character strengthening that can result to adolescence in periods like this one certainly did in the Depression. And likewise, I do think, I mean, if I view this as positive. I guess it depends on personal preferences, but I mean, I think a turn back towards thrift and away from kind of reckless spending, would be a positive for society. I mean, just expanding on that just a little bit. I mean, it's really interesting. So the Depression left us with this sense of thrift. And I mentioned the long inflation of the 70s, which kind of undid that to an extent. The lesson that young baby boomers learned as they were growing up in the 70s was that savings was for suckers, because their parents were all losing their savings. And meanwhile, having a large fixed rate mortgage or having a lot of debt was extremely attractive. And that was a lesson that seemingly, some boomers, learned for a lifetime thereafter. And so from the fruits of one crisis, in some sense, sprung the seeds of the next. So we do often see these kind of big generational turnings in kind of attitudes toward savings and debt in periods like this one. So I really think we will see that. I think we are already seeing it in this period, and I think that's a positive. The last thing that I'll mention, and I wish I could point to signs of it today, but I really can't. But certainly, one thing that typically happens in periods like this is when they do end, you're left with a burst of technological growth. When people lose their jobs, when old sclerotic companies fail, it makes room for new companies. When people who were stifled in old bureaucracies lose their jobs, some of them become entrepreneurs and take chances and create products that they otherwise would not have created. If you look at the 1930s, it was actually one of, I think it was the period of highest productivity growth in the 20th century, and it was a period of extremely high kind of breakthrough innovations, actually. So I hope that in garages and low-rent offices around the country today, we're seeing kind of the birth of new entrepreneurs and new companies. So perhaps that will happen and stand us in good stead as well.
All this is playing out with the background of huge problems coming with the climate, and of course, you hear that we need to consume more to stimulate the economy. We need to have lots of cheap energy to drive the economy, and all these things are completely contradictory in terms of long-term survival of civilization. So I'm just wondering if you how you see this in terms of that. We talk about having more green energy and so forth, but beyond that, in terms of lifestyle and people becoming more resourceful in terms of not having to buy something, buy more stuff all the time. And I mean, do we have some kind of profound changes that could happen, given that the economy doesn't seem to be functioning very well anyway?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I don't. It's not something I've looked at closely. I mean, I think one thing though that is happening, again, not exclusively as a result of this recession, but with the housing boom, we saw massive increases in the rate of building of huge homes out far away from cities in kind of brand new areas, and that's been a continuation of a long-running trend, but I think it really kind of clearly went too far, and I think with the bust, I mean, before the bust, we'd seen a resurgence of many cities already. Since the bust, cities, many of them have come back, while suburbs have come back less strongly or have not come back. And so, I think that perhaps this period will, if not end, then maybe weaken the long American love affair with huge houses, out in drivable but only drivable suburbs, and perhaps portend a shift back into urban settings. And if that happens, that would be very good for the environment, for energy consumption. I don't say that with any great conviction, but there are certainly some evidence that has happened in the last couple of years. The rate of growth in suburbs has which was very, very fast, has largely gone to zero. Housing growth in cities has actually come back. In many cities, and so perhaps that will be one change that might make us a little bit more green.
In the course of your research, did you find any thought that the middle class implies a lower and an upper, and that in fact 40, 50 years of significant efforts for Medicare, for instance, and aid to dependent children and all, may have made that distinction between the lower class and the middle much more amorphous, and in fact we are in a two-class world. Four-year college people who can type, and not four-year college people who can't type. And forget Bill Gates and the rest of the extreme at the royalty end. Is it middle class just dead, and you're fighting an old battle that can't be fought?
No, I think we can fight it. I think we should fight it. I mean, it's not clear to me that social policy has and particularly welfare measures like Medicaid has in any meaningful way kind of decreased the motivations or futures of people with a high school degree, who living on Medicaid is not a great thing, of course. I think that I think technology and to a lesser extent globalization, really are playing much larger roles here. And I say that in part because we're seeing these sorts of changes. We're seeing declining male workforce participation, for instance, and a failure of men to kind of get more higher education, not just in the U.S. That's happening kind of across almost every rich nation, regardless of welfare policy. So I think it's those forces that are strongest here, and they are very strong forces. And I don't think we can utterly reverse them, but I think we can mitigate them by better attention to education and by some of the other measures that I mentioned. And I think it's really incumbent on us in any case to try, because if the middle class really keeps shrinking, and the middle class isn't dead in the U.S. today by any means, but if it keeps shrinking, if we become increasingly a two-class society, I think that's a real problem for this country, which is based very much on its future orientation, on its optimism, and to a large extent on its large middle class rather than any shared cultural heritage. If we don't have a prosperous middle class and meaningful opportunities for upward mobility, I don't know what we have as a nation.
Last question.
The New York Times had an article in the last week about the correlation between job loss in major companies and stock prices and CEOs' bonuses. That it seems that about the time that the CEO has to have a certain stock price, a certain number of workers are laid off, and that therefore there is an increase in the stock price. And interesting correlation. Would you like to comment about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly true that corporate profitability is back. It's very high, again today, and corporations have largely achieved that profit growth by cost cutting rather than revenue growth, because demand in the U.S. and in most of the world really still remains pretty weak. So certainly, I mean, that is the primary cost cutting in general, and in part job reduction is kind of the primary way that American companies in general have restored profitability. You know, I don't know. I mean, about stock price and CEO compensation. I mean, you know, I think it's easy to take pot shots at CEOs and at very high income Americans today, and sometimes those pot shots are deserved. But you know, I think you know, a lot of CEOs are also kind of doing the best they can, facing the constraints they have, and facing a lot of foreign competition as well. I think in general, we'd be well served as a nation by continuing to celebrate, you know, people who do very well as a result of hard and honest effort, but also to expect more civically of those people, as we did in the 1970s and 60s and 50s, including by expecting them to pay higher taxes.
Well, thank you very much for coming.